It's been a strong argument that essentially command-based policies for reducing emissions can be costly, can be hard to design even with all the exceptions needed, and hard to implement, and may not even be equitable, etc. So how do the incentives arise when you impose instead a market-based policy like a carbon tax? Okay, cost effectiveness can be increased with a carbon tax by simply combining trips to work and the store, so people can choose to minimize their driving and reducing emissions by just optimizing their travel, reducing the number of cars in a household from 3 to 2. Okay, that's the average number of cars per household in the US, which would not be considered a low number anyways in other continents. Choosing to live closer to work or school, walking or bicycling to work instead of driving. Okay, so we talked before that a carbon tax would eventually drive the economy towards so-called mixed use and so on, where development will begin to take care of reducing commuter miles between living space, living quarters and workplaces and schools. But the question is always how long it takes. But nonetheless, technically, theoretically, that incentive is easily built in with a carbon cycle. And people who like walking, bicycling, or driving less in any case would choose to do that with or without a carbon tax, but with carbon tax they naturally float to the top. But there are also motivations for innovating new technologies and CAFE standards if there is a carbon tax implemented that is high enough to drive incentives for minimizing or reducing emissions. The concept that has to be remembered here is that people often tend to buy 3 cars anyways if they have a preference for having enough freedom within the family among the kids and the parents, or having the convenience of driving, especially in the suburbs where the mall is far away, the schools are far away, parents are working far away, etc. So there is a concept called consumer surplus, which is the difference between what something actually costs and the value the person gets from it. So if a family is spending $5,000 per year to own cars and they estimate the value of using it at $5,100, then a carbon tax of 100 can add to this 5100 and or to the spending of 5000, and then make them realize there is no consumer surplus, so they would reduce the car from 3 to 2. But if there is no carbon tax, and if they are getting a value of 5100 by spending 5000, then they are not easily incentivized to reduce from 3 cars to 2 cars. Okay, so these kind of calculations, this is just an example, but you can see how a carbon tax applied across the community can incentivize. But obviously, as we saw before, the low income households which don't have the option of owning 3 cars but only 1 car may not be happy with the carbon tax on top. Estimates in the literature vary, but my own research finds that a carbon tax could achieve the same amount of carbon savings as CAFE for 1/5 to 1/3 the cost. This is the author's statement, so I'm just reading it. The carbon tax can do this because it utilizes much cheaper actions, much higher up on the cost effectiveness list. And the argument in the chapter is that people, lower income people who tend to buy second-hand cars already look for fuel economy cars when they buy a car. So CAFE is not going to motivate them much more than what they already are looking for. Plus, they don't necessarily plan for many years of gasoline cost in any case. So for them, CAFE standards are not very strong incentives, but carbon tax can be. There are also concepts called double dividends and consumer choices, where CAFE standards claim that it can not only save consumers the fuel and reduce emissions for the country and the globe, of course, but also can help consumers from making a wrong choice of buying a big or fuel guzzler car. Okay, this is called double dividend, where there is the command-based policy to reduce emissions with CAFE standards that applies to manufacturers, but also the buyers are protected by avoiding making a mistake of mistakenly buying a big car. Okay, but people, as we said again, buy used cars, and they already have focused. They already focus on buying a smaller fuel-efficient car. So CAFE standards may not be adding that much more pressure on consumer choices, preferences, and dividends. You have to figure these out on your own. As I said, my own belief is that a combination is needed, as many research reports have shown, that just carbon tax or just command-based policies will not do it, but some combination will always be needed. So to conclude the chapter, carbon tax and other market-based policies spread the cost over all products, but command-based policies tend to be narrower and more expensive by missing cheaper options because they are targeted at specific sectors, specific activities, specific purchases, specific groups, and so on, like industries versus urban dwellers versus rural dwellers, etc. So the argument clearly is for market-based policies in this chapter. Command-based policies also do not incentivize new innovations. So CAFE standards incentivize new innovations to some extent, but price-based options do it much better and with less cost of enforcement. Okay, so you can see that the CAFE standards have had mixed success over time, but the idea that if there was a market-based incentive from the beginning, market-based policy, then probably would have been at a much better place, maybe. Command-based policy tends to be expensive per unit of carbon reduced because many of the actions people can take to conserve carbon are fundamentally private and individual, like driving habits, owning cars, living far away from work, driving to mall, driving to school or college, and so on and so forth. Incentive-based pushes in the form of a carbon tax passed into gasoline price can make us reconsider small decisions like occasionally combining or skipping trips. Okay, it is the combination of millions of these small decisions in a market-based policy throughout the economy that can create a real change at minimum cost. So if you have a bunch of market-based policies like carbon tax, then people, every activity where people pay for carbon begins to be affected towards reducing their own cost, their own tax. And those begin to add up and amount to a transformational behavior change. Okay, that's the idea. And as we said, distributing the revenues from carbon tax either as a dividend or reduced tax rates becomes then a key for maintaining support for it over time, as we saw from the example of British Columbia. Okay. To end, I took this figure from this productiongap.org, which shows historical production of coal, oil, and gas, and where the country's production plans and projections are headed. For coal, it's going to still increase for a few years and then maybe flatten out. Oil is expected to continue to increase, and gas is expected to continue to increase. And under their own Paris Agreement pledges, those levels are lower, okay, but The productions needed to be consistent with 2 degrees C and 1.5 degrees C targets are much, much lower than those planned and projected or promised. Okay, so just like we said, despite the agreements, the emissions continue to grow. Despite the pledges, the production of coal, oil, and gas is not even close to where we need to head in terms of the production needed for keeping the global warming targets of 1.5 or 2 degrees centigrade. Okay, I added that pessimistic note because while policies are great and market-based policies could be great, are they really going to give us a reduction in emission at the rate required while innovations for transportation, cars, trucks, appliances, etc. are not keeping up, investments in public transportations are not keeping up, and energy productions are trying to match the demand for consumption. Okay, the coal, oil and gas productions are basically not only to serve the country's needs but also to sell and make money. So there is still these contradictions in the system where we are not headed towards decarbonization at all. So policies have to somehow ratchet up the incentives to reduce productions as well, I suppose.